It's my pleasure now to introduce Bill Sewell. Bill is the Frank P. Hixon Distinguished Service Professor Emeritus of History and Political Science. Indeed, Bill is a distinguished specialist of early modern history of Europe, especially the history of France. He's the author of 5 books, 4 of them dedicated to the history of France, before, during, and after the French Revolution. His last book is entitled The Logics of History, Social Theory and Social Transformation, published in 2005 at the University of Chicago Press. And in this book, Bill shows the benefit of interaction between social science and history. Bill's interest in transdisciplinary approach makes him also the perfect guest for this comparative economics working group. Let me add a detail. I discovered Bill's work first time through your review of The Poverty of Clio, Resurrecting the Economic History by Francesco Obezzoni, a review published in History and Theory. I said, wow, great review. So I couldn't agree more with the review. And after that, after reading the review, decided not to write a review of the book because you've done the job absolutely perfectly. Today, Bill will talk about the ecology of firms in the 18th century Lyonnais silk industry back to France. Please join me in welcoming.
Thank you all. I should begin this with a disclaimer. Although I have published a bit about the silk industry of Lyon, my own research has been based only on the very abundant secondary literature. This is a publication. This is my publication, one of my publications about Lyon. This is a book. This is, I think, the best economic analysis of the Lyonnais silk industry by the Italian economic historian Carlo Poni. So what this means is that I've actually never been in Lyon's archives, and there are plenty of important questions that I would like to be able to answer but can't answer. Nevertheless, the history of this industry is, I think, so interesting, and its firm structure is sufficiently complex to make it worth presenting to this group. The silk industry of Lyon was aptly known as the La Grande Fabrique, that is, the great manufacturer. It stood at the apex of the European silk industries and was also the most innovative of all the textile industries in 18th century France with respect to design, to marketing, and technology as well. I'll turn back to the previous. This is much better to look at. You have a sense of the design here. In terms of the value of its product, it was easily the most important industrial complex in 18th century France, perhaps in 18th century Europe. In the 1780s, it employed about 14,000 adult men and perhaps as many as 20,000 women and children in Lyon, a city with a total population, including suburbs, of about 150,000. This was, in short, nearly a quarter of the entire population of this quite large city and accounted for some 40% of its active labor force. The Lyonnais industry produced cloth of extremely high value that dominated the high end of the French fashion trade. Let me show you a couple of examples of this is another, the one that I had before is a silk brocade. This is another silk brocade. This is a velour that's intended for upholstery and wall hangings. Now, France has been the leader of the fashion industry ever since the late 17th century. One of the keys to this fashion leadership was the opening of Louis XIV's astounding palace and gardens at Versailles, which quickly attracted the cream of the French nobility to the court and became the envy of all European monarchs. The monarch and the wealthy nobles famously engaged in ferocious fashion competition at Versailles, in part because it was run by this fellow, Louis XIV, who was himself really a dude. You can see here, this is of course for a formal portrait. He is mainly wearing silks. This is a silk velour gown with it looks like ermine lining, and he's also standing. There's a silk hanging above him, and he's standing on silk brocade. And these probably all came from Lyon. One of the things he's famous for is his red pumps. He regarded himself as having very good legs, but he was very short, so he adopted these high-heeled shoes. Okay, the high society of Versailles spilled over into Paris, where many of the great nobles actually maintained residences and where most of them preferred to live. Putting in an appearance at Versailles was absolutely required, but life there was also pretty tedious and very highly regulated. Paris had a much freer and more varied lifestyle. And it was in Paris that the nobles actually procured their silks and had their gowns and their suits fabricated. It was Paris, not Versailles, that had the shopkeepers, the tailors, the jewelers, the wig makers, the hat makers, the milliners, and other fashion providers. And I'm going to show you some examples of what. First is another picture of Louis XIV. Notice the marvelous cuffs of silk brocade. The rest is mostly velour. This is Denis Diderot, one of my favorite characters. He's wearing a blue taffeta suit. So even intellectuals at that time dressed much better than we do now. This is a coat, silk brocade. This is a really awesome piece of silk brocade with, notice the extremely fancy flower work. And then we have, of course, women's fashion. This is a really quite extraordinary cape in yellow with inwoven ribbon designs and baskets of flowers. This is a typical high-style dress, the kind of dress that you would wear in court, with the panier that on the sides, emphasizing the hips. And this is, I think, a truly extraordinarily beautiful, flowing, more easygoing type of gown. So this gives you a sense of the kinds of goods that are being made in the Lyonnais industry. This Versailles-Paris market provided a glorious opportunity for the Lyonnais, who reacted with great agility and creativity. By 1700, they had surpassed the Italians as Europe's most fashionable silk producers. The key to the ascent of the Lyonnais was the novelty of their silk designs. By comparison with Italian silks, the Lyonnais cloths were light and colorful, featuring luminous satins and taffetas like this, which were often enhanced with stripes, and rich brocades that typically featured floral patterns. Floral patterns were the great specialty of the Lyonnais. The initial slide that I showed you was a floral brocade. The Lyonnais silks didn't last as long as the heavier Italian silks, but this was of little concern to the fashionable consumers because they increasingly updated their outfits long before they wore them out. The genius of the Lyonnais was not simply to produce beautiful designs, but to change the designs very frequently in order to induce renewed demand. By the early 18th century, the Lyonnais producers were changing their silk designs on an annual basis. This strategy was adopted in order to keep ahead of silk producers elsewhere, especially in Italy, England, and Germany, all of whom quickly began to produce copies of the superior Lyonnais designs. But given the technology of the time, it took a year to decipher these complex designs. Then you had to kind of reverse engineer the designs, mount them on looms, and actually produce the cloth. So from the time that these designs appear in the shops, it would take a year to reverse engineer them. So if the Lyonnais came up with new designs each year, the older designs copied by their rivals would now be out of date by the time, at the moment that they hit the market. And this assured the Lyonnais an ever-increased fashion premium, which one historian has estimated at about 25%. So it was a very sizable markup you got by having new designs. Carlo Poni, in the essay that I flashed on the board earlier, argues that the key capitalist market strategy of systematic planned obsolescence was actually invented by the Lyonnais in the early 1700s, some half-century before the Industrial Revolution. So this was really one of the major innovations and permanent innovations in capitalism that can be traced back to Lyon, and quite early in Lyon. The Lyonnais silk industry was characterized by a detailed division of labor and a rather complex ecology of firms. At the apex of the industry were the silk merchants, the marchands de soie, who supplied the raw materials, financed the industry's operations, oversaw production, but they didn't do the production themselves, and then marketed the finished products. The silk yarns that were woven into these marvelous products were not produced in Lyon, but usually imported from Italy, which was the European center of production of raw silk and its spinning into yarn. Silk merchants' firms were generally partnerships, and they had only a few direct employees, such as a couple of clerks and perhaps a professional designer. There were some 400 silk merchants in Lyon in the 1780s, according to one count, which probably means something on the order of, say, 150 to 200 firms, all in competition with one another, in competition and cooperation, of course. So this was definitely not a highly concentrated industry. There were a very large number of firms. The production of cloth was based on a putting out system in which the merchants furnished raw materials and credit to silk weavers who did the weaving in their own domiciles. And the domiciles were built specially, apartments with very, very high ceilings, so that these huge silk looms could be fit into them. There were around 6,000 master silk weavers by the 1780s. The silk weavers, in turn, typically hired a journeyman weaver or two and would often have an apprentice. The silk weavers were, juridically speaking, independent entrepreneurs and were themselves employers of labor, petty capitalists, one might say, who owned their own capital, that is to say, their looms. They constituted separate mini-firms that might form weaving contracts with more than one silk merchant, but most were highly dependent on a particular merchant through basically credit relations. In the 17th century, a significant proportion of these weavers, to be distinguished from the merchants, the weavers, also produced cloth on their own account, where they bought the silk, wove the silk, and sold it themselves. They did this either exclusively or much more commonly as a kind of supplement to weaving on a putting out basis. As we shall see, this practice disappeared over the course of the 18th century. Unlike other putting out weavers in France or elsewhere in Europe, most of whom worked in villages scattered through the countryside, the silk weavers all lived in Lyon or in the immediately adjacent suburbs. Now, the reason for this seems to have been that it was easier for merchants to obtain adequate surveillance of a concentrated urban labor force. In the silk industry, this was extremely important because the yarns that were put out to the weavers were extraordinarily valuable. So a bit of pilfering could be a sizable dent in the profits of the marchands de soie. So this meant that, that potential losses through pilfering outweighed the higher remuneration that was required by urban workers, who, unlike rural weavers, of course, had to buy their subsistence goods through the market at high urban prices. Woolen and cotton, in the woolen and cotton industry, almost all of the weaving was done in the countryside. In this case, the fibers, while of a certain value, and there was always a pilfering problem, were much less valuable than silk, and so the balance came out to be to do the weaving to put out the weaving in the countryside. In Lyon, there were two distinct categories of weavers who worked on different sorts of looms: those who made plain or striped silks, and those who produced the patterned brocades. There were about equal numbers of weavers working in each of these categories. Both types of weavers required some assistance. There were, to begin with, I mean, in addition to the journeymen whom they hired. The journeymen were actually themselves weavers who eventually would expect to set up a household and a small firm. There were, to begin with, specialized workers, commonly the weaver's wives, who prepared the warp for the weaver and mounted it onto the loom. In the case of brocade weaving, which was the more complicated, the weaver was also assisted by a tireuse, that is a puller, whose job was to pull in proper order the series of cords that were affixed to specific warp threads in order to lift them up and to call out to the weaver the color of the weft yarn that should be passed through the shed in order to produce the multicolored design. So this young girl would pull on one and say red, and put it down, pull on another, say gold, another one pink, etc., through these complex designs, sometimes having as many as 15 or 20 colors. This job was often performed by weavers' daughters, but also by many young women from the surrounding countryside who migrated into Lyon, many of whom probably wound up marrying the apprentices or the journeymen, and then became a part of a weaver family themselves. Finally, the complex brocade design had to be read into the harness that selectively lifted the warp threads by a highly skilled, usually female liseuse de dessin, reader of designs, who was assisted by another specialist who tied the cords to the appropriate warp threads. So this was really a complicated affair. These jobs, which might be undertaken by the weaver's wife or daughter, or might be hired out, had to be performed every time the weaver switched from one design to another. Normally, of course, weavers would produce several pieces of cloth of a given design before re-rigging the harness. The brocade weaver thus required more assistance than the plain weaver. Mounting the pattern on the loom was a particularly time-consuming task, and I'm going to show you this is a modern recreation of a silk loom. It's being woven. The weaver here is a woman, so we know it couldn't be the 18th century. Besides, they didn't have color photography in the 18th century. Okay, but you get a sense of the size and the complexity of the apparatus from this. The brocade loom was a highly complex affair that inspired considerable technical experimentation over the course of the 18th century. In 1790, in fact, the jacquard loom was patented by a Lyonnais inventor. It replaced the complex harness of cords and the tireuse with a punch card design, the first use of digital programming in manufacture. The jacquard loom, which for many years continued to be powered by hand, was actually adopted very widely in the 19th century and greatly improved the efficiency of brocade weaving. And here is a nice example of the jacquard loom. You can see this scroll here is of thick paper perforated in such a way that automatically the machine will pick up the right warp. Okay, it's worth noting that the weavers' firms were also household enterprises with some similarity to those that Ken Firth told us about back in January when he was speaking about the family farm on which he grew up and about the household enterprises that were characteristic of ancient Mesoamerica and lots of other places. In such firms, tasks were performed by family members whenever possible, and the goal was not so much maximization of income as sustaining the family and making full use of the family's labor. These family firms typically involved significant levels of between-family cooperation, so that if one family was idle, they would then work for another family on some of these tasks, and vice versa. And I suspect a lot of that was done through barter rather than on a paid basis. They typically involved significant levels, of between-family cooperation, also significant levels of self-exploitation on the part of family members. That's also typical of the family firm. That is very long hours and extracting all kinds of work from children from the age of 8 years or so up. Now, the silk merchants, as opposed to the silk weavers whom I've just been talking about, oversaw the manufacture of cloth, but they were also responsible for providing the designs and, of course, for marketing the finished pieces. These tasks were complicated by a geographical problem. In this respect, we could be back in the Sahara, but the geographical problem was not quite as great, which was that the prime market for silks was not in Lyon itself, but rather in Paris, which was 350 kilometers to the north. This meant a travel from Lyon to Paris of 5 or 6 days by coach, or 2 days by fast mail service. Here there's some parallel with the Saharan traders who also had to deal with markets at a distance and had to have trustworthy agents. The merchants themselves occasionally made this trip to Paris. I mean, it was only a little over a week to go, about 2 weeks to make the round trip. This was important to make contact with the Parisian mercers, the retailers who sold their goods to the public. But they also sent samples of their new designs to the mercers via the post and relied on commissionnaires who relayed orders from customers and from mercers who hawked cloth to the retailers and sent relevant news to Lyon along with samples of successful new silk designs that were produced by rival firms. These commissionnaires were not, as far as I can tell, salaried employers, but rather agents who got a commission on sales. But since I haven't looked at the account books, or correspondence, I don't know precisely how this worked. Bridging the distance between Paris and Lyon was also crucial for the production of design. The production of ever-new designs, as I've already mentioned, was the key to the superiority of the Lyonnais silks in the market. The Lyonnais silk industry was absolutely unique in the heavy investment that it made in design. So by the later 18th century, there were perhaps as many as 200 designers in the Lyonnais industry. In other words, about one per firm. Some working freelance, others employed directly by a firm, some of them actually as partners with silk merchants in the firms. And significantly, no other silk industry in Europe employed more than a handful of designers. So this was really a Lyonnais specialty. These Lyonnais designers underwent a thorough training. They completed a rudimentary apprenticeship in weaving so that they would understand what it is that was being made and the tricks of the weaving trade, and were trained in drawing and flower painting. Once the young designer found employment with one of the merchant manufacturers, he would spend several months every year in Paris, where he was to keep up on all aspects of the art and fashion world. For example, visiting the Versailles Gardens, the Gobelin tapestry works, the Sèvres porcelain works, the displays of shells and butterflies at the Jardin des Plantes, not to mention looking at all the flowers in the Jardin des Plantes, which was then called the Jardin du Roi, going to museums, art galleries, theaters, and churches. The designer also visited all the shops of the most exclusive mercers, where he could examine the most up-to-date furnishings and accessories for the fashionable household. Indeed, it was in the mercers' shops of Paris that, to quote a contemporary tract, the most marvelous of Lyon's productions over the years are piled up every day. Paradoxically, it was only by going to Paris, the leading center of silk sales, that a Lyonnais could get access to the full range of designs being made in his own city. Since, they were relatively secretive with respect to one another, but if you went to Paris, you were just another consumer as far as anybody knew. On the basis of this Parisian experience, which imparted both knowledge of what designs were selling well, a sense of general fashion trends, and considerable artistic stimulation, the designer would write reports back to Lyon and would prepare a new set of designs. Most of the new designs, of course, would be variations on those currently in vogue in Paris. It's always the way designing is done. But some were more adventurous efforts that anticipated or set fashion trends. Back in Lyon, the designs would be copied onto squared paper, and the designer would work in cooperation with a weaver and specialized technicians to transfer the designs from paper to loom before they were put out to the weavers who would produce them in substantial quantities. So here is an example of one of the designs of Jean Rodel, who was the most famous of the Lyonnais silk designers, that you can see is drawn onto very finely sort of like graph paper, squared like that. By going to the point of each of the squares, you can see what kind of thread needs to appear in order to get the shade that's required for the design to work. Designers who were the key link between the Lyonnais production and the Parisian market were highly sought after, and they were very well paid. On the tax rolls of 1758-59, their assessments were similar to all but the very upper level of the silk merchants, and many of them eventually became partners in leading silk firms. Among the crucial forms of capital of a silk firm was its stock of designs, which were carefully archived, whence they could be retrieved in a new year, a few years later, perhaps being enlarged or shrunk, or using new colors, or enhanced by a background or projected onto a background of stripes. And here is an example of a book of designs. The ecology of firms in the Lyonnais silk industry might also be considered to include the firms of the Parisian mercers, who displayed and sold the bulk of the silk goods, and who frequently advised the silk merchants about design trends that, say, broad or narrow stripes were doing well this season, or that lavender or orange or puce was the popular color. On learning that puce was all the rage, the Lyonnais could quickly change the background colors of some of their brocades in order to boost their sales. The mercers and silk merchants were collaborators in both monitoring and developing tastes in Paris. Their long-distance but multiply interconnected relationship involving direct correspondence, the sending of samples, and intermediation by commissionnaires and designers was absolutely essential to the industry's expansion and its continued profitability. So there's a sense in which the Parisian mercers are also a part of the ecology of firms of this industry. There's yet another layer of complexity that must be added to this picture of the ecology of firms. Like most urban industries in old regime France, the silk industry was regulated by a guild, which had initially been established in 1554. Its statutes were amended several times in the following 2 centuries. Now, this guild was unusual because it was actually a composite body made up not only of master weavers, but also of silk merchants. And the silk merchants' work was commercial in character. They put out weaving to their fellow guild members, that is the weavers, to the master. Okay, they put out the weaving jobs to the master weavers, and they usually themselves had not been trained as weavers. So it's really two quite distinct categories who are both masters of this guild. At the end of the 17th century, at the end of the 17th century, a sizable minority of the master weavers worked on their own account, either entirely independently of the merchants, which was fairly rare, or more commonly as a supplement to weaving yarn that was put out to them by the merchants. So they would do 3/4 of their weaving for merchants, but then they would buy some silk yarn on themselves and try to make a profit on that. At that time, that is at the end of the 17th century, the guild statutes actually made no official distinction between master weavers and merchants. But revised statutes in 1702 introduced the distinction and also required that 4 of the 6 guild officers be merchants and that the 2 weaver officers be chosen by the Lyon municipality, which was largely controlled, of course, by the silk merchants, who were they were the big guys in town. This merchant-dominated body then put a gradual squeeze on the weavers over the next few decades, over these weavers who were working on their own account. First, they required them, the guild required them to pay a sizable premium to the guild in order to do weaving on their own account. And then finally, in 1731, they forbade the practice altogether. There ensued a fierce struggle that went on for a long time, got the policy reversed briefly in 1737, but by 1744, the ban was reinstated for good, and it was from that time on illegal for the master weavers to undertake weaving on their own account. So why should the merchants, who had made no objection to weavers working on their own account in the 17th century, have fiercely opposed the practice in the 18th? The answer lies in the new centrality of design in the industry's practices. The merchants claimed, very plausibly it must be said, that the independent weavers were in fact copying the precious designs that the merchants had previously put out to them for fabrication, of course had paid designers to design. Effectively, in other words, the weavers were pirating the merchants' intellectual property, as we would put it, just like the English and Italian producers were doing. But for the weavers, the abolition of their right to produce on their own account meant the end of any hope of becoming an independent producer, and hence the inescapability of their absolute dependence on merchants. So there was terrible bitterness between these two categories within the guild. In the 1730s and 1740s, the weavers refused to accept this fate, and they struggled mightily against it until they were utterly crushed. It was not until 1786, a few years before the French Revolution, that the weavers once again mounted a movement against the merchants, a kind of strike. But by this time, their demands had radically shifted. Rather than agitating for the lost right to work on their own account, they instead attempted to impose a detailed and uniform price schedule for their work on every variety of cloth, what they called a tarif. In effect, they now recognized their proletarianized condition and attempted to bargain for higher and more predictable income rather than for a return to the lost status of independent producers. So this marks a real shift in the mentality, certainly of the weavers over this period, as well as in their real possibilities for them. This strike in 1786 eventually failed, but it was pregnant with a certain future. In the early 19th century, the silk weavers took up once again basically the same struggle to impose a uniform tariff on the merchants. The outcome of one of these struggles was a brief but spectacular weavers' uprising in 1830, when the silk weavers actually took control of the municipality of Lyon for a few days. It was the brief but heady success of this workers' uprising that inspired the young Karl Marx, along with plenty of French workers and radicals, to see a revolution of the proletariat as the great hope for the future. And here I'll shamelessly show you the cover of my first book. The reason for it is the illustration that I used on the cover. This is Lyon. If any of you have been in the old city of Lyon, you would immediately recognize those buildings as Lyon. This is where they're coming under fire from the troops of the police. On the banner, it says, vivre en travaillant ou mourir en combattant. In other words, live working or die fighting. The Lyonnais silk industry obviously was highly peculiar in its structure and in its market position as well. This structure was never, as far as I know, replicated anywhere else. But this was, in more than one respect, a vanguard industry. It was certainly a key player, perhaps the key player, in the rise of the French fashion industry to worldwide leadership in the course of the 18th century, a leadership that the French have yet to relinquish, in spite of the attempts of the Italians, the Japanese, and others to overtake them. The Lyonnais industry's precocious focus on systematic innovation in design as the key to profitability was crucial to establishing the fashion dynamic that has ever since been one of the key dynamics of capitalism in general, not just in the fashion industry. Think about changing designs of cars, of devices, as we now call them, right? Electronic devices and so on. The Lyonnais silk industry also gave rise to one of the most ingenious inventions of the Industrial Revolution, that is the jacquard loom. And finally, its weavers, odd proletarians that they were, as themselves employers of labor, nevertheless formed a vanguard of the French and eventually of the European working class movement. So, worth knowing something about the Lyonnais silk industry, I think. Thank you.
Well, I suppose this was a special gift for me because I was a student in Lyon. I received a BA in Lyon. This absolutely.
You recognize this right away.
Working silk. Yeah. Emily?
Thank you so much for your talk. Your work seemed to me to be a preface to a book I really enjoyed called Fabricating Women. And in that book, they speak of a tension between seamstresses and tailors occurring simultaneously to the time period you're talking about. And I was wondering, and there's that book really plays up the debate about who sponsors or who invents fashion.
Yes.
And I was wondering, men or women.
Yeah.
And so I was wondering if you had any evidence that would say that the designers leaned one way or another in that debate. Sought out seamstresses, sought out tailors, played a neutral field.
Yeah. Well, I think to be a good designer, what you had to do is you had to hang out in places where fashionable people went. Like you would go to the Jardin des Tuileries and watch the people who are and notice the garments being worn by the people who are engaging in a promenade there. And in the 18th century, women had more garments than men, but not by very much. And the men's garments were just as fancy. I mean, that amazing suit with the sort of peony flowers down the front gives you some sense of that. So I would say that to be a good designer, you had to be quite aware of both what women were wearing, what men were wearing, what seemed to be hot in a given year, and the kinds of garments that were. Whoops! What happened? Oh well. You remember the long, there are two gowns that are of the type that women designed, innovated, and made very popular. One was that gorgeous yellow sort of cape-like thing, and the other was the striped bit. The kinds of designs that had the panier, I think, couldn't be made by the seamstresses. That had to be done by tailors. But there was a tendency over the course of the 18th century for people to want lighter and more comfortable garments. This was true both of men and of women, actually. So that one of the major garments, a form of garments that's on the rise in the 18th century, and this was sometimes in silk, more often probably in cotton, was the dressing gown. And people would have these dressing gowns with wonderful Indian prints on them, and they would wear them. They'd wear them out in the streets. They'd wear them as daily wear, and they'd only put on these fancy things when they were going out for a promenade or to the theater or something. So there was definitely a shift over the course of the 18th century in the direction of more light and wearable things and away from this highly restrictive stuff that was the Versailles kind of style.
I guess to probe a little bit deeper, I guess my question was really about whether or not the guilds you're speaking of had a stake in how the outcome of the guilds in Paris with regards to seamstresses.
As far as I know, they were simply reactive with respect to that. That is, what they were doing is that is the designers and the commissionaires, and also the mercers were scouting out the market. They were trying to figure out what sold, and whatever sold, if some new kind of, if one of the silk designers invented a new kind of floral pattern, and a lot of people were buying it, the next year there'd be a whole lot of those that were made by the Lyonnais designers. So they reacted very quickly to changes in style. Yeah.
Does religion play any part in this? Since Lyon was Protestant at some point.
Yeah, it wasn't Protestant by this time, certainly. I don't see how it would have. I mean, the one indirect way in which religion plays a part in the complications of the silk industry comes through mourning rituals. Whenever some member of the royal family died, there would be a period of mourning. And if it was a dauphin, that is, the person who was going to inherit the throne, it would be for an entire year. And what that meant was that everybody in Versailles and people going to the theaters had to wear black. This was great for the people who weren't doing brocades, but for the brocade people, it was a catastrophe because they would have all this cloth that they were in the middle of producing, and then suddenly one of these royals croaks. And now what they need is a whole lot of plain black or fancy black stuff. So this was one of the risks in the business was that you would have these periods of official mourning that would just immediately drop practically to zero the demand for these beautiful, colorful cloths. Yeah.
You mentioned the merchant partnerships. This question comes out of the previous China presentation. Were partnerships based on kinship, or were they based on dialect, place of origin first?
I don't really know. This is again, as I said, I haven't been in the archives, and I don't know that much about how the partnerships worked. I would be very surprised if there wasn't a fair amount of kinship. That it would be somebody and son, or brothers or cousins, partly because you can trust these guys, but it certainly wasn't only that. I mean, I'm sure there were plenty of partnerships. Like, for instance, these if you hired a designer and sent him off to Paris, and he was coming back with really great designs. After 7 or 8 years, you might very well make this person your partner. I would guess that the incidence of partnerships between kin would be no higher in this industry than in other industries, other partnerships in France. And I don't know what that level is. I'm sure it's well above 0, but it's probably a minority phenomenon that you have partners who are related by kin. What's that?
In France at that time, in general, the dialect and place of origin play the dialect and place of origin play a significant role.
I'm sorry.
Dialect and place of origin.
A dialect and place of origin. Among people of this class, no, because they all spoke French. You couldn't be in this. That is, the weavers would speak dialect probably. The weavers were from Lyon, either from Lyon or some people migrated in from the countryside immediately around Lyon to become weavers. So they probably spoke a certain amount of dialect, but France was basically a bilingual country. Many peasants couldn't speak any French at all. Most people who lived in cities could speak both French and whatever the local dialect was. And people at the level of the partners in these silk firms and the designers had to be completely fluent in French. Otherwise, they wouldn't have a chance. After all, I mean, everything was really pointed at Paris. So they had to be fluent not only in the French language, but in the ways of Paris in order to be successful in this business.
One last question, just before to intervene on the question of religion, from my experience from Lyon, but I have no kind of figures to provide numbers. The reputation is that the bourgeois family, really capitalist are Protestant, and the workers, especially Camus, were Catholics. But this may be completely wrong. The reputation, even from my own experience, very strict education, bourgeois family, Protestant, but it's completely empirical.
It may be possible. It's again one of those things that since it hasn't been brought up in the secondary works I've read, I don't know. Yeah.
In the course of the Lyonnais silk industry in the 2 centuries that you're talking about, did technological innovation create rising entrance costs for people who wanted to become weavers, journeymen who wanted to become weavers?
Well, the looms were already pretty complicated and pretty expensive at the beginning. And this is another question that, if I were actually going to write a book on the economics of and the economic history of this industry, that would be one of the interesting questions. That is, these looms are quite costly. The weavers were not very rich. I presume that they bought them on credit, and the credit was supplied by the merchants. So this is probably one of the things that tied the weaver to the silk merchant with whom he was dealing. But surely these were quite expensive affairs. Now I think it might be possible that there certainly was. There was a lot of experimentation that was going on with these looms, and Vaucanson, who was an important figure in the sort of mechanical invention in the 18th century, attempted to make a sort of mechanical loom that would operate the way the Jacquard loom did, and failed. But there was a lot of there were probably I don't know the details of the history. I'm not sure anybody does, because not enough of these looms have been preserved. But there probably were various changes in the design of the the harnesses that the threads went through and so on. That sort of culminated in somebody getting the bright idea of a punch card. What I don't know is whether it would be possible to simply get a high quality mechanic working in wood, is basically what they're working on, who could re-rig your loom in such a way that it had the more up-to-date stuff. If so, that wouldn't be horribly expensive. If you had to replace the whole loom, that would be extremely expensive.
I think the time has come to thank our two speakers.